Christina Flesher Fominaya joins us now from Nottingham in the UK. She's an expert in social movement and politics and reader in social politics and media at Loughborough University. Christina, great to have you here on the News Hour. Now, as we just saw in that video, it seems that there's unrest everywhere. Hong Kong, Lebanon, Chile, Algeria, so on. The list goes on. But each protest is unique in its own way. Each one has a different sort of trigger mechanisms. But what are some of the things that all of these protests have in common? What's a common denominator here?
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head. There's different triggers, but there's definitely a common denominator going through most of these protests. And essentially, there's two interrelated issues that connect all of these protests. On the one hand, you have a demand for greater social justice and greater economic equality at a time when global inequality is really extreme. We know, for example, that about 50% of the adults in the world have less than 1% of the total global wealth, but we've got the richest 10% that possess about 82% of the global wealth. So, of course, this varies between individual countries, but there is a lot of inequality. Many working people, even in developed and wealthy nations, can't make it to the end of the month. Their basic needs aren't being met. So people are aware of this, they're angry about it, and it gets triggered by things like increases in the cost of basic goods and services. So definitely the economy is an issue and a demand for social justice. But there's a second related issue that's also really important, which is a demand for greater or better democracy. And what we're seeing here is something really curious. If we just look at democratic countries, there's a very interesting paradox that's happening, which is that while it's clear from the protests that people are increasingly dissatisfied with their elected representatives, they're increasingly dissatisfied with the democratic institutions, their commitment to the value of democracy is still really, really high. So people still want democracy, they still believe in it very strongly, but they just don't think that their democracies are working very well. They don't believe that their governments are actually acting in the interests of the citizens, but instead are acting in the interests of a global and national elites.
Okay.
So those are elements that really tie together all of these protests to one extent or another.
But having protests and having demonstrations isn't always sort of a guarantee that you're going to have a positive outcome in terms of change or whether the democratic process that you were just mentioning. In some cases, it turns out to be really bad. And I think the best example is with the Arab Spring. Why don't protests always succeed?
Well, I can give you two answers to that. Basically, when protesters want to expose government corruption, for example, or government brutality, or they're protesting against government policies that are benefiting the elite and not the citizens, the people involved in government have access to some resources, some pretty powerful resources that protesters don't have access to, such as the power to legislate, the power to use the army and the police, and even sometimes the judiciary against the protesters. So when governments are willing to use those resources against protesters, there's, to silence critique and to silence dissent, there's very little that protesters can do besides continue to mobilize. But there is a second element besides repression, which is what we found is that when there's pre-existing social movement networks existing in a country, say, before the protests erupt, they have a better odds or a better chance of keeping mobilization going after the street protests are over than in situations where those pre-existing networks don't exist. So those are two factors that we could look at.
Christina, I mean, one of the questions I ask myself is, if we live in a democracy, if we want a better democracy, then why is it so difficult to change the system?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of entrenched institutions are very resistant to change. Institutional cultures run very deep. I think it's clear to most people that our democracies really aren't working as well as they should be. And political party systems seem to have something to do with this. It seems like our political parties spend so much time trying to win elections and stay in power and fight between themselves and parliament, and not enough time really trying to resolve the social problems of citizens. So they enter into this really polarized dynamic where they try to stress what's different between them instead of stress what unites them when it comes to representing citizen interests. So I think our political system probably needs an overhaul. But I think oftentimes there's a curious narrative that it's the protesters who are supposed to sort this sort of thing out. But of course, the protesters are just raising grievances against their elected representatives who are actually paid to sort this thing out. So I don't think it's really reasonable to expect the protesters to have all the answers to the problem.
That's a very fair point. All right, Christina Flesher Fominaya, thank you very much for joining us here on the NewsHour. I do appreciate your analysis.